Okay.
Okay. Okay, now we're not live.
We're ready to go. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's 9:30 and I'm going to call the meeting to order. In response to COVID, we continue to host council meetings electronically. Members of the public are invited to participate by accessing the meeting, which will be live streamed on the Middlesex Centre YouTube channel. Before I move to the next agenda item, I'd like to take a moment to mention the work of a group of residents here in Middlesex Centre. Trees Middlesex started ordering and selling trees back in 2011. Some of the residents had noticed that some of the large old trees that framed our concessions and roadways were getting old, and in some places they were decaying already and falling down. And they had an idea. Their catchphrase, which is "Help us beautify our Middlesex Centre roads one tree at a time," sums it up perfectly. I don't have all the dates for when different residents joined the project, but in alphabetical order, the people who've been involved include John Balderston, Charlie Bolton, Ruth Bycraft, Tom Davidson, Bill Dow, Rolly Gibson, Bill Thurwall, Mel's Vanderlaar, and the late Ken Veldhuis. Every fall for a decade, starting back 10 years ago, they took the orders from residents and then they placed their requests with the Winkelmolen Nursery in Linden. In spring, they did the big job that was sorting and labeling and getting everything all organized so residents could take delivery at the Poplar Hill Park. The trees were largely native species, including oaks and sycamore, but Mr. Balderston mentioned that Autumn Blaze, a very beautiful red maple tree that was really very popular. So everything wasn't native, but they tried to make sure that they stuck to species that were local. Normally, they would sell between 250 and 300 trees, and John commented that 315 was probably at the high end. So by my calculation, over the last 10 years, that means that at least 2,500 trees have been planted as a result of all of their efforts and work. This story has a great ending, although the current members of the Trees Middlesex group are retiring. And that is, they thought about succession planning, and it's great news to announce that the Poplar Hill Lions are going to be taking over. I'd like to thank the Middlesex Centre Trees Group for their work for the municipality. Undertaking that work will make sure that we all have the gift that keeps on giving for many years to come. Thank you for your efforts and great work over the years. Now, there are no additions to the May 12th Council agenda, and no one has noted any pecuniary interest. So I'm going to move to delegations, and the first presentation is Watson Associates, who are going to be doing the asset management plan presentation. I'll turn it over now then to the presenters. There we go. Good morning, Peter.
Hi, good morning.
The floor is yours. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can proceed. Okay, perfect. I think we're ready to go. So firstly, good morning to the mayor as well as to members of council. I'm very pleased to be joining you this morning to present the municipality's asset management plan. As I think all of you are well aware, this has been a project that we have been working on with municipal staff for the past couple of years. And we are very pleased to see it come together the way that it did. I think you have a fantastic team of staff who have been absolutely instrumental in bringing this all together, helping compile data, but as well providing lots of very excellent input throughout the development of this plan. I would like to stress that the purpose of the presentation today is to provide you with information, sort of summary of the plan that you have been provided a copy of, and also to provide an opportunity to receive your comments and ask any questions about the plan. Ultimately, the plan will be brought forward in its final form. I believe it's June 9th, and we will continue to receive comments and questions until the end of May, responding to those as they come in and making any modifications or adjustments to the plan before it's ultimately finalized. So there's quite a bit of material that I'm looking to cover this morning, so I'll just dive right in. The plan for this morning really is to first go through all of the major components of the asset management plan using a very specific example. I'll be using bridges and culverts, just so we can get into a little bit more of the technical details and how the plan is actually developed. And then subsequently, we will go through a higher level summary of each of the components of the asset management plan, looking at an overall summary of the assets that are included in the plan, providing an indication of the scope of these assets, their replacement costs, as well as the condition state of those assets. We'll then look at the levels of service being supported by municipal assets. We'll look at the strategies that the municipality has to manage the life cycle of those assets. We'll look at the financial strategy. And then finally, we will wrap up with a brief overview of the next steps. So the first component of the asset management plan, and again, we'll start with a specific example here for bridges, but that first component of the asset management plan for each of the assets or service areas is a summary of the assets. And mainly this is attempting to answer the question of what do we own as a municipality, how much is that worth, and what condition is it in? And so using the example of bridges and culverts, and just on a side note, these are the structural culverts that are subject to the inspections every 2 years. We can see that the municipality owns and manages 50 bridges as well as 56 culverts. And the estimated replacement value is just under $118 million. Where possible, you'll see this throughout the asset management plan, we have included maps of the assets to better illustrate the scope and extent of the assets that we're talking about. And the map that is on the right-hand side of this slide shows the locations of those 106 bridges and culverts with the colors corresponding the assessed conditions. And I'll come back to that a little bit more shortly. So the next thing we look at are levels of service. And this is important because we are shifting away from looking at the assets themselves, but looking at it through a service lens. That is understanding the services that the various assets support and understanding how the community experiences those various services and what aspects of the service are important to them. And so the levels of service framework seeks to describe both qualitatively and quantitatively the outputs or objectives that the municipality intends its assets to deliver. There are three main components to that level of service framework. We have service attributes, which capture the characteristics of a service that are important to the users and or the managers of that service. We then have levels of service statements or community levels of service, which describe in qualitative terms the service itself and what the municipality intends to deliver with respect to that service. The example being provided here, it's not specific to bridges, but to, for example, provide a comfortable ride for road users is an example of an overall service or one of the service objectives. And then the final component of that level of service framework are performance measures. And these are typically quantitative in nature, and they allow a municipality to identify in more specific terms what the level of service is, what the targets are for the future, and over time also allows a municipality to measure its progress in that regard. And so in this example, a technical level of service measure looking at the quality aspects of road services, for example, would be the pavement condition index, which is an overall measure of the condition of the roads, which in turn is a measure of the quality of ride that you can expect to get by driving on a particular road. So going back to the asset condition just for a minute here, as that is one of the ways that we measure the level of service for many assets. The asset management plan identifies a summary of the condition of the assets, as well as descriptions of the municipality's approach to assessing condition for each type of asset or each service area. So continuing with our example of the bridges and culverts here, the condition is assessed every 2 years by an external engineering consultant. There's a regulation in place in Ontario which requires municipalities to undertake these inspections of bridges and culverts every 2 years. And so there is an established process for that. The overall measure of condition for bridges and culverts is the Bridge Condition Index. And based on the most recent assessment, we see that the average bridge condition index is around the 66 to 67 mark for both bridges and culverts. And this corresponds generally to a fair condition state based on the ranges that were established. And on the right-hand side of the slide here, we also see how those bridge condition index values have been assigned to the qualitative condition states going from excellent to poor, and the corresponding colors, which are then shown on the map as well as in other sections of the report. Where available or where possible, we included pictures, as sometimes it helps to have a visual idea of what the different condition states actually represent. And the inclusion of pictures is also encouraged within the asset management regulation, which does set out some requirements for what we have to include in the municipal asset management plan. So back to the levels of service, again, continuing with our example of bridges and culverts, at the top, we see that the two key service attributes we have identified for bridges are scope and quality. And from a community level of service perspective, we have included descriptions of the traffic that is supported by municipal bridges. And then for the quality attribute, we have included the pictures of bridges in different condition states, which is what we saw in the previous slide. Now, at the bottom of part of the slide, this includes the technical levels of service and the performance measures that are used to indicate the level of service that's being provided by the municipality, as well as the proposed level of service targets in the final column. And so for the scope attribute, the technical performance measure is looking at the number of structures that have loading or dimensional restrictions, as this would effectively reduce the scope of the assets that certain types of road users can use. And currently there are none, and the target moving forward would be to maintain that. Loading restrictions are not generally a good thing, as they can be an indicator of a deteriorated condition state and a reduced level of service for some road users. So that's the scope piece. Under quality then, we are looking at the average conditions, specifically the average bridge condition index. And we previously looked at what those averages are on the previous slide. Staff are going to continue to work on actually establishing targets for what that average bridge condition index what the municipality would like to see that at for future years, doing some sort of cost benefit analysis to determine what an appropriate level of service would be moving forward. And then one additional quality measure is looking at the number of structures with a bridge condition index below 40. And that's because that would indicate that those structures are perhaps at a greater risk of potentially having load restrictions placed on them, and likely would require more significant investment over the short to medium term. And so currently, 7 of the municipality's 106 structures fall into this category. And the goal over the long term would be to minimize the number of structures falling below that threshold of a bridge condition index of 40. So again, trying to avoid structures falling into that poor condition state. So the next major section looks at lifecycle management strategies. And so firstly, the lifecycle management strategy is an overall plan for how to manage the capital expenditures related to lifecycle activities that are required to be undertaken over the course of an asset's life. There are 2 distinct components to that lifecycle management strategy. Firstly, we have a high-level or generalized model that allows us to estimate the total lifecycle costs related to an asset, not just looking at, let's say, 10 years, but looking at the total lifecycle of each asset and what those lifecycle costs would be. as well as the performance of the asset over that life cycle, because depending on how early or what type of intervention we perform has an impact on the asset's performance and average performance over its whole life. And then the second major components of the lifecycle management strategy is a more specific decision-making process for identifying more immediate priorities or short to medium term capital needs. So that recognizes that not every asset degrades the same way, because some assets, even though it's a similar type of road as another segment, might get a different type of traffic. It might be exposed to different environmental conditions. So there are different factors that will affect the actual life of any particular asset. So that second component of the lifecycle management strategy looks at how do we develop that more short-term forecast? How do we identify where those priorities are over the short term as well? So to explain that a little bit further, we did develop these generalized models for all of the assets. Again, continuing with our example of bridges and culverts here, we are looking at how the asset condition degrades over time. We have three illustrations here for the bridges as well as for the two types of culverts. And we're also looking at the life cycle activities that are typically performed over the course of the asset's life, and then the corresponding improvements. So for example, we see for bridges, with the illustration, you see the estimated or expected deterioration of the asset's condition over time. We then have identified what life cycle activities would typically be undertaken at various stages of that asset's life to bring that condition back up, to keep it in a state of good repair and prolong its useful life. And then we're also looked at what the impact of that is and what the useful life extension is. So here are three examples of life cycle models that were developed for bridges, for concrete culverts, which have fewer rehabilitation treatments, and for steel culverts, which typically, for example, don't get a rehabilitation, they just get replaced once they stop functioning properly. So there are big differences between what that life cycle management strategy or model looks like, but just to provide some examples here for the specific life cycle models that were developed for the bridges and culverts. So these models then allow us to look at the costs that are associated with the various life cycle activities and allow us to estimate the average annual life cycle costs associated with a particular type of asset. And so in this example, we are looking at the life cycle of a typical bridge, where we would expect to perform a couple of rehabilitations throughout the asset's life, followed by a full replacement or reconstruction. And that would give the bridge a total useful life on average of about 75 years. And so looking at the life cycle costs over that 75-year lifespan, those are about $13,600 or about $181 annually. And that cost here is expressed per unit of per square meter of bridge deck area. And then finally, we can also express that average annual life cycle cost as a percentage of the asset replacement value, which in this case is about 2%. And I'll come back to that percentage a little bit later in the presentation this morning. So doing a similar analysis for all of the 50 bridges, as well as the 56 different types of culverts that the municipality owns and manages, allows us to estimate the average annual life cycle cost for the entire asset class. So for the bridges and culverts in total, that average annual life cycle cost is approximately $2.3 million, as you see in the bottom right of the table on the slide here. So then we bring all of that together so that we can develop an appropriate financial strategy. And so we have the short and medium-term needs, which in this case are based on the recommendations within the bridge inspection reports, which are updated every 2 years. So those are very good at identifying the specific priorities based on someone going out to each individual structure, looking at its condition and determining what should be done to keep that asset operational. Looking beyond the 10 years, then also, we are using the life cycle models that we developed to estimate the long-term needs, and doing that generally over a 100-year forecast period. And what you also see here is the average annual life cycle funding target, and that's illustrated with the dashed horizontal line. And providing that level of funding, again, that average annual life cycle funding target, would allow the municipality to save during periods of below average investment needs, as in the example of bridges and culverts we're expecting over the next decade or so, but then being able to draw on those savings during periods of above average investment needs when we start to look at years beyond our immediate 10-year forecast. And I'll get into a little bit more detail of this in a more aggregated sense for all the assets later on in the presentation. So that covers off the major components of the asset management plan and how they're developed for each asset area. Having looked at that specific example, we'll now go through the major sections of the asset management plan, providing a higher level summary of all the assets that are included within the plan. So firstly here, in terms of the assets that have been included in this asset management plan, the combined replacement cost of those assets is approximately $706 million, which is a significant amount of investment. Just on a side note, that represents an investment of approximately $107,000 per household. So again, a fairly significant amount of investment into infrastructure that's been done historically and leading up to the municipality having the portfolio of assets that currently exists. Now, measured by replacement value, roads and related infrastructure are the single most significant component of the municipality's asset portfolio. Together, the roads, sidewalks, and streetlights, bridges and culverts that together represent the transportation network or asset supporting transportation services, those account for about 38% of the total asset replacement value, with roads being about 19%, the bridges and culverts being about 17%, and then the sidewalks and streetlights being about 2%. And then on the right, you see a very high level description of what is included in each of those asset categories. This is by no means meant to be a exhaustive list, but just to provide an indication as to what's included in there. So within the roads, there are 567 centerline kilometers of roads that the municipality manages, 38 kilometers of sidewalks, just under 1,900 streetlights, as well as the 50 bridges and 56 culverts that we talked about previously. So again, significant number of assets as well, for stepping away from just the dollar values. So then the next most significant areas are the environmental assets, which together, so water, wastewater, and stormwater, which combined represent about 45% of the replacement value, with about 18% of that being in wastewater services, about 16% being related to stormwater services, and about 11% of the total asset replacement value being related to water infrastructure. And then we also have municipal facilities. So this includes the various buildings as well as the parks assets and facilities or buildings within the parks. That together represents about 14% of the asset replacement value. And then finally, we have the fleet and equipment, which support the various service areas, which together represent about 3% of the asset replacement value. So on the next slide here is an overall summary of the condition of these various assets. Again, this corresponds, just to explain this illustration first, the total asset value being about 706 million. The relative width of each of these bars represents the relative share of that 706 million that resides within these various asset classes or service areas. Just to explain the colors, and I recognize we didn't include a legend here, my apologies for that oversight, but generally the colors go from the dark green being very good or excellent, and then we get into the very good, good, fair, poor, and very poor when we get into the oranges and reds. The gray component represents where condition has not been assessed and also could not be estimated based on age because the age of the assets is not known. So the biggest chunk of that is within the roads, where the gray area represents the gravel roads, which have not been assessed for condition explicitly. We also see some minor gray areas or unknown conditions within the stormwater category, very minor within the facilities, some minor components that were not explicitly assessed there. as well as for the sidewalks and streetlights, which again have not had a condition assessment completed. Overall, what this indicates is that the condition of the municipality's assets is generally good, with relatively small portions of the assets falling into the poor and very poor states. And I think that this is reflective of the municipality's asset management practices, and also to some extent at least the relatively young age of some of the infrastructure as well, specifically with the water, wastewater, and stormwater assets. Again, those are long-lived assets and provide service over a long term. So just by virtue of being relatively young in the grand scheme of things, they tend to be in a relatively good condition state. So next here, we'll go through, I'll spend a little bit of time. I want to focus on the levels of service to just show you how the levels of service are being proposed to be measured for the various assets, and then we'll get into a summary of the lifecycle management strategies and the financial strategy. So first here for the roads and related assets, looking at the community levels of service, again showing the scope of the assets. We've included maps showing the extent of the municipality's road network by surface type, and in terms of that quality aspect, we've included photos of pictures that would be in the various condition states to hopefully help with the communication aspect. But then focusing on the technical levels of service and specifically how we propose to measure quality. So from a qualitative standpoint, the technical performance measure we've identified is looking at the average pavement condition index, which currently is just under 70. That's based on the recently completed road needs study. And the longer term target would be generally to try to maintain that overall average above 70. The one additional measure we've included here are the centerline kilometers of paved roads with a pavement condition index below 40. This is because we just by looking at the average, we don't necessarily know whether there are certain assets that are falling below some critical threshold. So similarly to what we did with the bridges, we're looking at what proportion of that road network is below a pavement condition index of 40, and generally that being a fairly undesirable condition state for a road to be in. So currently there are 30.5 kilometers of roads or centerline kilometers of roads in the municipality that fall into that category. And again, the longer term goal or target would be to minimize the amount of road falling into a PCI less than 40. So the next service area being water. From a community levels of service perspective, we've again included maps showing the areas of the municipality that have water servicing. We are also required by the regulation to include an indication of the areas of the municipality that have fire flows available, recognizing that water has two key functions. There's the drinking water that we all use, but also the fire protection service that it provides as well. So we've included those maps. And then from a reliability standpoint, we're required to identify whether there have been any boil water advisories within the past years and what sort of resulted in those. So the municipality hasn't had any boil water advisories in the past 3 years, which is certainly a good thing and indicates an overall reliable system. Now, from a technical level of service perspective, and again, I won't focus so much on the scope because that's more of a just indicator of to what extent there is water servicing within a municipality. But looking at the reliability service attribute, we're looking at, as one technical level of service measure, looking at the number of connection days per year where a boil water advisory is in place. So as I mentioned previously, there have been no boil water advisories, so that performance currently is 0, and the target moving forward would be to maintain that at 0. We're then also looking at the number of connection days lost per year, or looking at service interruptions as a result of water main breaks. So that number is currently very low, 0.029 connection days lost per year per connection. And the longer term goal would be to minimize any number of service interruptions due to water main breaks. And then finally, we have a third level of service measure, which is looking at the replacement cost of water assets, in this case, that have a condition or that fall into a condition state of poor and very poor. Now, recognizing that this is not a condition that has been assessed by someone looking into the pipes or looking specifically at the assets. It is an approximation based on age. But if we start to see some of these water assets fall into the poor and very poor condition state as approximated by age, it would be an indicator that those assets might need replacement sooner rather than later, and that there's a greater risk of asset failure because they have aged to the point where they're beyond their useful life, typically. So currently there are no water assets that fall into the poor or very poor condition state, and the longer term target would be to minimize the number falling into that category. So similarly for wastewater, we have a map showing the areas in the municipality that have wastewater service. We are required to identify whether there are combined wastewater and stormwater mains in the municipality, which there are not. And also we're required from a community level service standpoint to identify or speak to or describe the effluent discharge that's released from the sewage treatment plants. And that's already captured within the respective environmental compliance agreements. So there's just a cross-reference to that. And one thing to keep in mind with water and wastewater, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that those are heavily regulated services. A lot of these performance measures that are included here are already tracked on an annual basis through the various annual summary reports that are prepared. But it is a requirement to include some of that information in the asset management plan as well. So then from a technical level of service standpoint, again, under the quality aspect, we're looking at the number of connection days per year with service disruptions due to wastewater backups, and relating that to the total number of wastewater connections or properties connected, which for 2020 was 0.00036, which again is a very, very low number, and that's a good thing. I believe there was just one wastewater backup that's on record for last year affecting one connection. So that's what's reflected in that value. And again, the target moving forward would be to minimize the number of these wastewater backups. Also from a quality standpoint, we're looking at the number of effluent violations per year due to wastewater discharge. There have been none. The current performance is being reported based on 2020 information. And moving forward, this is something that municipal staff will be updating council about to track that performance and see how you are doing with respect to those level of service targets moving forward. So again, that there have been no effluent violations in the previous year. Target would be to keep it that way as well. And then again, we're looking at the replacement costs of wastewater assets that have an age-based condition rating of poor or very poor. Currently, there are none that would fall into that category. And so moving forward, it would be a question of, or the target would be to maintain that generally, or to minimize the number of assets falling into that category. For stormwater, again, we have a map showing the areas that have stormwater service, which is the community levels of service piece. And then from a technical level of service standpoint, a number of these performance measures that are required in looking at the percentage of properties that are resilient to a 100-year storm, looking at the percentage of the municipal infrastructure that's resilient to a 5-year storm, that performance has not yet been evaluated. This is an area where I think fairly commonly across the province, municipalities have not completed assessments in that regard. So this is something that staff are going to continue to work on and try to understand a little bit better so that you can get a sense of that current performance, as well as ultimately establish more specific level of service targets in terms of that level of protection or resiliency from a stormwater standpoint. We have also included, to be consistent with the water and wastewater infrastructure, as a technical level of service measure, the replacement cost of stormwater assets with an age-based condition rating of poor or very poor. And currently there are none that would fall into that category, and the proposed level of service would be to maintain that. So one final piece here on levels of service, we don't have the levels of service formally defined for the non-core assets. So generally the service or the community level of service for things like facilities and vehicles and equipment is for those assets to function as expected. So for them to function reliably and support the more specific levels of service that they're intended to. So for that, to measure that reliability aspect, we developed a number of performance measures, which for facilities look at the number of components that are in poor or very poor condition. And there were some extensive condition assessments that were completed by both a external consulting firm as well as municipal staff directly. There was a lot of effort that went into that, and really good information coming out of those condition assessments. So we can now look at what are these, how many components, what are those components, and what is their value that fall into these poor and very poor condition states. And that would be indicative of those assets probably not meeting the level of service expectations, so having to be addressed sooner rather than later. So there are about 36 facility components that are currently poor or very poor, and the combined replacement value of those is about $1.7 million. And those items have been included in the 10-year capital forecast that's been prepared to try to bring that level of service up in light of trying to minimize the number of these components that fall into the poor and very poor category. And then similarly for vehicles, we looked at what proportion by replacement value of vehicles fall into the poor and very poor condition states. And that's for the time being an age-based assessment largely. So looking at what is the life expectancy of these various vehicles, how old are they currently, and really are they exceeding their useful life? Are they beyond their useful life expectancy? Again, indicating that they would likely need replacement sooner rather than later. So there's about 4.4% of the vehicles by replacement value that are currently rated as poor and very poor based on age. And the goal would be to minimize the number of vehicles falling into that category moving forward. And then lastly, in terms of the equipment, there has not been a specific performance measure identified for that component yet. There's a little bit more work that will need to be done in creating a comprehensive inventory of the equipment and understanding really the age or condition of all of those items. But really the performance of equipment is largely evaluated by its ability to support the service levels that are identified in other areas of the plan. And so the general intent would be to keep the equipment in a state of good repair to ensure that it adequately supports service provision in the areas that are using the equipment. So that's the level of service analysis. I'll now go to the lifecycle management strategies. So earlier we looked at a detailed example of how the lifecycle management strategy was developed for the bridges and culverts. And we talked about the two components of the lifecycle management strategy, that being a generalized lifecycle model that allows us to prepare a long-run forecast of lifecycle needs, looking at the full lifecycle of the assets. And then there's that more specific identification of the specific lifecycle needs for a shorter time frame, in this case, a 10-year forecast. And so the table on this slide provides a summary of how both of these components of the lifecycle management strategy were addressed for the various asset categories. So I'll use the example going back to bridges and culverts, where the 10-year forecast of specific capital interventions is based largely on the recommendations of that bridge condition assessment that's completed every 2 years. But then we also have these long-run life cycle needs, which were estimated based on our life cycle modeling done within the asset management plan. Again, looking at the full life cycle of the assets, not just the next 10 years. So there are various sources for the 10-year capital forecast. Again, where possible, we were looking to leverage the work that staff has already done in identifying what those priorities are based on their understanding of the assets. As you are familiar with, staff have prepared a multi-year forecast of capital needs. So we kind of merged that information with some of these external reports around bridge inspections, for example, to inform that 10-year forecast. And then used various methods of establishing or estimating what those long-run life cycle needs are as well. Where possible, we use the life cycle modeling, looking at, again, the assumed or predicted degradation of the assets over time, looking at the various life cycle interventions that would need to be performed over that life cycle. And in other cases where the condition is not necessarily known directly, we are looking at modeling those life cycle needs based on the age of the assets or an assumed useful life of the assets. So based on the lifecycle management strategies, and particularly the longer term forecasts that allow us to estimate full lifecycle costs, we then estimated an annual lifecycle funding target for each asset class. And those annual lifecycle funding targets are identified in the third column of the table, and they total $17.6 million across the whole asset portfolio. So what we're then doing is comparing those annual lifecycle funding targets to the level of capital funding that's built into the municipality's 2021 tax levy, as well as the various user fees. And there will be an illustration of this on the next slide, but the difference between these two amounts is referred to as the lifecycle funding gap. And so currently that lifecycle funding gap is approximately $5.8 million. In other words, the municipality is currently funding approximately 2/3 of the full lifecycle funding needs. And that funding gap is different for each of the asset classes, with the most significant gap, at least in relative terms, being within stormwater services, where the stormwater fee revenues are currently providing about 48% of the lifecycle funding target. And perhaps unsurprisingly so, since the stormwater fees are still relatively new and are still ramping up, you could say, to fully recover the cost of service. And also, just generally speaking, stormwater infrastructure is one of the less understood areas and often underfunded simply due to a lack of information about these assets and their life cycle needs. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we see water services, where the current level of capital funding is generally on par with the life cycle funding target. And so the goal here would be to maintain that level of investment moving forward. And so what we are then also showing in the final two columns here is that the current level of capital funding, as well as the life cycle funding target as a percentage of the asset replacement value, to show us the percentage reinvestment rate. So these are percentages related to the replacement value of the assets. And why we do this is to allow us to do some benchmarking. And so what you would have seen show up on the right-hand side of the slide are the asset reinvestment rates that are identified in the 2016 Canadian Infrastructure Report Card. And in the last column, we see that the national average reinvestment rates as of 2016, based on municipalities that participated in providing data for that initiative, are identified in that last column. And what you'll also see to the left of that are the target ranges for what the optimal annual reinvestment rates should be. And a few key observations here. Firstly, for all asset classes, the municipality's reinvestment rates are either within or above those national averages that were identified in 2016, which is really great to see. So specifically for stormwater and for wastewater, you are within those ranges that we saw municipalities investing at in 2016. And then for facilities and transportation and wastewater, we actually see, facilities, transportation, and water, rather, you are above national averages in that regard. And then the other observation I would like to make is that the targets that were established through the asset management plan, which we see in this column here, those are generally in line with the ranges that are identified in the 2016 Infrastructure Report Card as well. So that's a little bit of benchmarking in that regard. So next we are going to look at the financial strategy that was developed in light of the 10-year capital forecast and the long-run lifecycle funding targets. So firstly, to a few introductory words about this graph. This is illustrating the 10-year capital forecast for, in this case, tax-supported assets. And this is presented in real or uninflated values, and it also excludes any growth-related infrastructure that would be paid for through development charges. And the blue bars represent capital expenditures, and then the two horizontal lines represent different averages, with the lower or dark blue horizontal line representing the average annual expenditures over the 10-year forecast period, while the upper orange horizontal line represents the long-run average annual lifecycle funding need, looking at the full lifecycle of the assets. And since that long-run average is higher than the average for the next 10 years, that indicates that more significant asset investment needs are coming up beyond the 10-year horizon. As the infrastructure further ages and starts to require more significant renewal and replacements. And then we also see the little dot in 2021, and that represents the current level of lifecycle funding. And that current level of capital funding includes budgeted contributions to capital reserves. It includes grants such as the gas tax and OCIF, as well as debt servicing costs related to existing outstanding debt. And the reason we include those debt payments because once that debt is repaid, that money will then be freed up to contribute to reserves for future life cycle needs. So that's a little bit about the composition of that current level of funding. And then the gap that we see between the current level of capital funding and the life cycle funding need is what is typically referred to as the funding gap. And for the tax supported assets, as we saw in the table previously, that funding gap is approximately $3.8 million. And so in light of that, we have proposed a financial strategy that would see the municipality gradually ramp up funding to close the life cycle funding gap by 2030. And while this slide is providing that detail for the tax supported assets, the same strategy has been proposed for the rate supported assets of water, wastewater, and stormwater as well. And as we'll see shortly, because the magnitude of the funding gap is different in these areas, the resultant rate impacts of moving towards full life cycle funding will also differ. One final slide here on the financial forecast before we summarize the impacts or implications of this. So this is an illustration that provides all of the components that together come the financial forecast that has been included in the asset management plan. And again, looking at specifically here tax supported assets. So I'll step through the various elements. And so the green portion of the bars here represents the capital expenditures that we saw earlier. But now, in addition to those capital expenditures, this illustration also layers on operating expenditures, which are the orange portion of the bars, as well as the debt servicing costs. And again, that's just a portion of debt servicing costs that is not paid for through development charges. So this gives us an idea of the total net expenditures. Now, relative to those expenditures, we are looking at the revenues generated from the tax levy each year, which is illustrated with the solid black line, and also recognizing the expected grants, which again would largely be the gas tax and OCIF funding, as illustrated with the lighter gray line. And then behind those bars, you see the light purple, I'll call it mountain, which represents the estimated closing balance of capital reserves in each year. And these capital reserves really act as a stabilization mechanism. So while the goal is to establish a stable or gradually increasing revenue stream to minimize any drastic year-over-year changes to the tax levy, the reality is that those specific capital expenditures do fluctuate from year to year. And so in years where the capital expenditures, when layered onto the operating expenditures and debt servicing costs, exceed the revenues forecasted for the year, the capital reserves can be tapped into to offset some of those costs and shave off that peak in investment need. And you can see that based on the expenditure forecast for especially the first 3 years, there will be some drawing down of the tax supported reserves occurring to the end of 2023. And then as the tax levy revenue increases toward full life cycle funding levels, and as the capital expenditures dip in later years below that long run average, the financial strategy provides for some accumulation of money in the capital reserves to offset those future life cycle needs. Okay, so then this final slide here just summarizes the annualized impacts resulting from the financial strategy that was developed to support the level of service targets and the lifecycle management strategies identified through the plan. So what we're looking at here are the annualized impacts, firstly on individual tax bills as a result of looking to achieve that target of fully funding the asset lifecycle funding needs by 2030. So that is estimated to be about a 3.4% increase annually to tax bills. So that does include, as noted in the notes section here, some growth in the assessment base as a result of both reassessment and additional development in the municipality, which would offset some of the tax levy increase requirements. So that, again, impact on individual tax bills would be about 3.4% annually. One thing to note here is that this increase does not include the municipal portion of growth assets or new improved assets as well. So that's something that the municipality and staff are going to be working on as well, is incorporating those growth assets as well and seeing really what the impact is once those assets are assumed or expanded infrastructure in response to development. So again, we're looking at about 3.4% annual increase in tax bills, about 2.2% increases to water billing revenues to support this plan. This is, I know there's a presentation coming up after this on the water financial plan. This is much aligned with what's shown there. In fact, these two exercises were happening somewhat in parallel. So the rate increases in light of some additional growth that's also expected to offset some of those revenue requirements. The actual rate increases have been estimated at about 1% annually for water specifically. When we look at wastewater, there's a requirement to increase revenues by about 7.3% annually over the next 10 years. One thing to note here is that a part of that billing revenue increase would again be offset by growth in the number of customers and growth in the amount of water consumption on which to some extent wastewater billing is based. So there would be the impact on individual wastewater bills or wastewater rates would be expected to be somewhat lower than this. But this is the revenue increase that would be required over the next 10 years. And then finally, for stormwater services, that revenue increase from stormwater fees would need to be about 11.5% annually over the next 10 years. Again, part of that would likely be offset by additional development occurring, so there being additional properties that would be paying that stormwater fee, but the overall revenue for stormwater services would need to increase by about 11.5% annually for the next 10 years. So that summarizes the impacts. I just want to touch on the next steps here. Firstly, focusing on sort of the bigger picture, not necessarily next steps pertaining to this project or this asset management plan. These are items that the municipality will be addressing in the coming years as it continues to refine and enhance the asset management planning process, refine the asset information, and so on. They've all been documented within the asset management plan as well, so that they're in there. I just wanted to highlight a few of them. So firstly, in terms of boundary roads, currently these are included fully in the municipality's asset management plan, but to the extent that there may be sharing of costs with neighboring municipalities, a process should be developed to account for that. So that's something that staff are going to be looking into moving forward. And then in terms of condition assessments, while there already are some established processes for assessing the condition of some assets, as we talked about with the bridges, for example, through those inspections every 2 years, roads through the road need studies that are periodically completed, as well as facilities through a specific inspection process as well. For a number of other assets, the current condition I noted earlier is strictly estimated based on age. And so there are some examples here in terms of how staff are going to be potentially looking into more specifically assessing the condition of these assets based on water main breaks, for example, for water mains, doing CCTV inspections for wastewater and stormwater mains, and so on. So there are some examples that were discussed and something that staff will be working on moving forward. A few more here. The first one pertains to bridges. So the replacement cost of bridges in the asset management plan includes a factor, an adjustment factor, to account for the deck area of replacement bridges typically needing to be larger than the current structure. But there hasn't been a comprehensive assessment done on which structures, when replaced, would need to be larger. So that's something that the municipality may address through maybe the next inspection report, or doing that internally, but just identifying which of the structures would be replaced like for like versus which ones would need to be made bigger to conform to today's design standards. So a little bit more work needed on that front. Then there might be an inclusion of some additional assets that weren't maybe explicitly included in this version of the asset management plan, specifically the municipality's gravel pits, which do have some life cycle funding needs as well. So staff will be looking to include that, as well as a more detailed inclusion of equipment, more comprehensive inventory of the equipment items to be included in future iterations of the plan as well. And then also related to the condition assessments, there may be a further development of the levels of service. So we've identified some basic performance measures, largely looking at that reliability or quality aspect as we step through, but staff may be refining that and with input from the community and from yourselves in terms of understanding at a more granular level of detail, what are these service attributes we want to measure? What are these vital statistics we want to be able to look at to measure what that level of service is for facilities, for example. So that naturally will further develop over time. Then we've identified to continue to refine the lifecycle management models based on both observed performance of the assets as well as observed responses of the assets to the lifecycle activities that are being performed. So for example, how much improvement and how much additional life does a resurfacing provide for a road? So looking and tracking that performance over time more systematically so that those lifecycle models can be fine-tuned. Then, as I mentioned earlier, almost at the end here, incorporating those future growth-related assets into the asset management plan in the future as well. I think that work is going to need to reflect some of the master servicing plans that are being completed this year, as well as the development charges study, which will likely be updated in 2022 in light of some of those master planning exercises or master servicing plans. And then finally, as you may be aware, the municipality is going to be implementing asset management software to help manage the data related to the assets, because there is a massive quantity of data that sits in behind the outputs that you see in the report or on the screen here. So there's, and it becomes fairly challenging to manage that in spreadsheets or just reports. So the asset management software tool is going to help make that process more efficient and really track the key things better over time. So one final thing here then, in terms of next steps for this project, we're happy to receive any comments, any questions you may have about the plan. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to continue to receive comments and questions until the end of May, and then we will be making any needed refinements to the plan itself, and then the final asset management plan will be brought forward for council to consider approval of that plan on June 9th. And then after that plan is completed, there will be annual reviews of asset management progress that staff will be bringing forward. So again, asset management is something you're going to see more and more of year after year. And then there will need to be a formal update of the full plan at least every 5 years. That's something that's required by the regulation. So that concludes the presentation. I really appreciate your time. I know this took a while, but there's a lot of information in the plan. And again, if there are any questions or comments, happy to receive those now.
Well, thank you, Peter. The report card is appreciated. There's a lot of work that's been happening, and understanding where we are now, the current state, and where we're headed for the future is important. It's also good to know what next steps you're saying we're undertaking and you're undertaking, and how all of that's going to integrate. So personally, I really appreciate this, because, well, having information like this for decision making is just essential. If we can't make good decisions if we don't know where we're at and where we want to go. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to move now to comments from staff. Tiffany Farrell is going to jump in here and give us some thoughts. There she is.
Perfect. So through you, Mayor DeVete, I will draw attention to our asset management plan report that was put onto council agenda. So there are 3 recommendations that we are looking at having passed, and the mayor will go over that in detail in a little bit. So overall, I wanted to really point out that with respect to the Ontario Regulation 588/2017, the municipality with this plan and passing the plan in June of 2021, we will be meeting all of the milestones that are required for a municipality that is our size. Peter has touched on through his presentation with respect to the growth aspect, and that isn't a requirement for a municipality our size based on our population. However, it is a goal of what staff really want to do with this plan and bringing it forward, and that would be something that we'd be looking at in May 2023 is probably realistic there. So the plan does cover all the things that are required, and there was a lot of effort put in place by all staff here at the municipality, which is very much appreciated. So through the work with Watsons and Associates, they've done such a great job. They've worked with all of our teams to ensure that the levels of service that have been identified are what we are providing to our residents today, and things that we want to improve for the future, specifically when you're looking at the bridges and culverts and the size that they're looking at increase in that. So these are things that are being incorporated into the plan. This will then lead us into what we need to do in order to maintain this and the financing of such a strategy. So all of this is combined within this plan. You'll notice from the plan, you'll see snippets of the information and the asset inventory. However, we do have all that information. It is stored right now in Excel, and we will be moving towards phase 2, which is implementation of all of our asset data into our new DUDE solution asset management software. So phase 1 essentially is preparing this plan to meet the regulation and get us started. So we have a really good understanding of the completeness of our assets. We have a good understanding of our levels of service and how to maintain that level of service and how to finance it. So phase 1 is essentially complete when council approves this plan as amended throughout this month on June 9th. And then we'll begin to work on phase 2, which is implementing the asset management software, and then presenting to council on a yearly basis on the asset management progress and changes, as well as incorporating this into our budget. Each year, the municipality has incorporated this information into our budget. However, now that we have a final plan in place, it will be a lot more detailed. I would say that the entire budget process for 2022, which you'll see this fall, will be completely revamped. One of the things that I would like to incorporate is with respect to that funding that Peter has outlined. We have a certain amount that we need to raise on taxes in order to pay for our asset management. These are our current assets that we own, and then we'll be moving into the growth related assets that are supplemented by DCs, but there could be a benefit to our existing residents, and then those efficiency type things that you're going to be seeing, which essentially would pay for themselves down the line. However, you might have a higher cost up front, and then we'll be incorporating our operating changes. And I envision this to be very detailed throughout that process, being led by the asset management plan, as well as incorporating our strategic plan that was approved earlier this year. Overall, I think that the plan is very thorough, and it is a lot to get your head around. So we are giving council as well as the public some time to read it, comprehend it, ask questions, provide comments, and we can make those updates before the June 9th council meeting and get that back to council. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Mayor DeVete. If there are any questions of council, myself, as well as the Director of Public Works and Engineering and the Director of Community Services are on the call that can answer more of the technical, and Peter is here as well to jump in.
Thank you, Tiffany. I guess partly we are going to be digesting, but I'm going to ask then, is anyone on council concerned about anything in particular or want any kind of clarification from any of the parties that Tiffany mentioned? Councillor Heffernan, go ahead, please.
This is for Peter. Thank you, Peter, for that presentation. It actually is easier to understand than just reading it. So that was good. Just a question on the current value of assets is 706 million. So that's the current replacement value as of today, correct? So then you mentioned 107,000 per household. Now, is that like that's replacement to assist with replacement? Is that over 10 years? Like you said, 107,000, is that over 10 years, 100 years? How is that calculated?
Absolutely. Question. So that's strictly looking at the 706 million and dividing it by the estimated number of households in the municipality, just to get, so it's at a point in time. It's if you were to replace all of the assets today, every household would need to pay $107,000. So it's a measure that's often used for benchmarking, just to get a sense of what your value of assets is, or investment value per household.
Thanks. And the other question I had was around the water, wastewater, and so the 107,000 per household, that included the water, wastewater, et cetera, right? Which is only actually paid for by specific users, but the 107 is just a blanket. Yeah, okay. So then just using the water as an example, the suggestion is the revenues need to go at 2.2%. Now, is that on the rate or on the infrastructure life cycle charge, or how is that figured?
So the 2.2% is an increase to the total revenue with being generated from water rates. So that's the total revenue combining the infrastructure portion of that charge as well as the other portions. So it's an increase to total revenue.
Okay, thank you.
I'll go to Councillor Arts now. I thought I saw your hand. Yep, go ahead.
Through your mayor, I think this would be a Peter or Rob question. When I got reading the bridges reports and all that, I'm going, well, geez, this is missing, that's missing. And then I find out there's a certain size. So I would like a definition of a concrete culvert, a steel culvert, a bridge, like maybe not now, but a picture, because I'm going, well, I'm missing this, I'm missing that, and I don't even know. Yeah, I need a better definition of those three things, like structurally, pictures, size, or something. And when I was reading some of the stuff about if the road goes from gravel and you pave it, does that mean we need to that different asset management? So we actually have to increase reserves because that we upgraded a road?
So through Madam Mayor, I'll take the first part of that for sure anyways. Regarding the structures, Councillor Arts, so the threshold is 3 meters. So anything larger than a 3 meter span, whether it's a circular culvert or a bridge, that's what falls under that definition of structures for bridges, steel culverts or concrete culverts. If it's smaller than 3 meters in diameter, it doesn't require the biannual inspection. So we do have obviously a number of those throughout the municipality. And we currently undertake the replacement of those just through the operating and maintenance budgets, not through capital. So we intend to inventory those, but we haven't got there yet.
Okay, but then what's the difference between a concrete culvert and a bridge? Because they're both concrete.
Yeah, it's just the way they're formed. So if you think of a concrete culvert, it's typically like a precast box culvert. It may not have the parapet walls or other components to it. And that's, I'd say that's the easiest thing to envision. It would be like a precast culvert that's dropped in. So it could be a circular culvert as well, right?
Because we can get precast bridges too, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there's a number of different products out in the market now as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Part two, I'll jump in on, and maybe Peter will want to add some. So right now, the work on gravel roads is covered under the O&M budget. So once it's converted to a hard surface road, we would have to look at the longer term capital replacement costs of that hard surfacing.
So we'd have to increase the reserves because we paved the road, correct?
I believe so. But Peter, if you want to add anything.
Yes, that's correct. So it's right now the plan assumes that the municipality will manage the assets as they are. If there are any sort of level of service improvements in a way by converting a gravel road to paved, then yes, you would have to then increase that annual contribution towards those life cycle costs reflective of the life cycle activities that the road would require being a paved road. So there would typically be an increase there in funding required to support that asset moving forward.
And one last question, a new subdivision, it's got new water lines, new sewer lines, new waste, it's got all the, how long is that infrastructure supposed to last? Like a stormwater drain, is it 100 years?
Through Madam Mayor, I'd have to confirm. I think it's 75 years is the useful life. Peter, I'm not sure if you recall off the top of your head.
I don't recall off the top of my head. I can certainly follow up with you on that. We looked at, it isn't necessarily even just one age for every type of main. We looked at the material and the life expectancies of different materials, for example. So it does get fairly granular in terms of the data behind the scenes.
Thank you.
Is there, oh, Councillor Shipley, go ahead.
Through the mayor to Peter, just a question on stormwater, Peter. Maybe it's a two-part question, actually. So if we use ARVA, the stormwater pipes in the subdivision come out to a county road, is that part of our asset? Then if I go to Ballymote, it's all county road. So I'm just wondering how that's part of our asset when the county would replace it at their cost.
That's a good question. I may need Rob to jump in on this as well. We did look at where the ownership resides. So we did just try, what we're intending to do is to include assets in here that the municipality has a financial obligation for. So even though it might be under a county road, if replacement came up, if the municipality would be liable to pay for that replacement, then it was included in this plan.
Yeah,
so there would be some level of coordination, I guess, required with the county, for example, in terms of planning for the replacement. But because the financial obligation is with the municipality, those costs have been included in this plan.
Yeah, by and large, the sewers on county roads we will contribute to, so that we will definitely have a financial obligation. And that's something that needs to be discussed further with the county. But really, they would only be looking to pay for their proportion of runoff from the road. Anything that services that takes water from a subdivision, say, right, if it's 75% our water, it's going to be 75% our cost for replacement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Is there anyone else? I don't see any hands. So the motion before us is that report number CPS 22-2021 dated May 12th, 2021 regarding the municipality's asset management plan be received, and that the asset management plan presentation by Watsons and Associates dated May 12th, 2021 be accepted, and further that staff be directed to report back to council on the final asset management plan for approval on June 9th, 2021, after council and the public have had time to ask questions and make comments. If I could ask for a mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Scott and Councillor Shipley. Any I'll call the motion. Any opposed? And I don't see any. That is carried. Thank you again for that very thorough presentation, Peter, and we'll see you in June.
Thank you very much. Take care. Okay,
take care. We'll move on to 4.2, which is the BMA Management Consulting long-range water plan, and we have Bruce. He's not here yet.
Just down in June.
Okay.
Hey, we should see Jim on the screen.
There he is.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jim. We can hear you.
You can hear me now? Okay.
We can. Will
Okay.
we be seeing you as well?
My camera on my computer here is malfunctioning, so.
Okay, well, we can hear you really well. So whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and move on to the long-range water financial plan. Is your presentation going to be on screen? There it goes. Yeah. Great, we can see your presentation as well now.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Worship Members Council. Okay, in terms the long-range financial plan was done in conjunction with Ontario Regulation 45307. And that regulation requires a municipality on renewal of their license to prepare a 6-year financial plan. Middlesex Center has taken a more proactive approach in this regard. And what we've done in conjunction with staff is prepared a 10-year financial plan. So the intent of this financial plan is to provide the municipality with a realistic and informed view of operating and capital expenditures that are needed over time. So the long-range financial plan, it provides a framework for guiding the annual budget, but it does not represent the formal budget. We've worked with staff. Of course, it's a long-range financial plan, so it's based on assumptions, and we made great effort in conjunction with staff to present accurate financial projections based on the data that's available at this time. The council priorities, planning policies, there could be changes to service levels, consumption projections changed, and all of that, all of those variables should be evaluated when preparing your annual budget. And the long-range financial plan then should be adjusted accordingly. So the intent of the long-range financial plan, the guiding principles, is to ensure that there's sufficient financial resources, first of all, to maintain your water assets in a state of good repair. We saw from the last presentation that generally your water assets are in good repair. We want to make sure that there's a reasonable degree of stability and predictability in the rate burden. The last thing you want is to have volatility. A lot of the assets are capital intensive, as you did hear from the last presentation as well. And when an asset comes to for renewal, you don't want to adjust the rates and cause hardship to potential hardships to residents. We want to make sure there's a fair sharing in the distribution of resources. So the current ratepayers should be paying their fair share of the capital infrastructure. We want to ensure that there's sustainable cash flows throughout the period. Maximize financial flexibility. In that regard, we want to make sure that your debt levels are affordable, and also you have sufficient reserves for financial flexibility purposes. And then we want to make sure that the programs are maintained at their existing current service levels. So as you did hear from the last presentation, the capital operations are very capital intensive. And what we've done here is prepared a graph showing the replacement of those capital assets over the next 50 years. The total replacement cost, as you heard previously, for the water infrastructure is about $77 million. And that's based on 2021 dollars. And this chart is showing replacement costs on an inflated basis. And we used an inflation factor of about 3.5% for water infrastructure assets. So you can see it is a fairly new system, as you heard previously. And throughout the first few years, up to around 2043, 2044, your contributions to reserves would be exceeding, the recommended contributions to reserves would be exceeding the replacement of the assets. But once you get beyond 2044, you can see there's some large spikes, large capital financial asset replacement needs. So the prudent thing to do is now start planning. You have an opportunity. You have a number of years before there's these large capital needs. So the prudent thing to do is start planning for these capital needs and putting away sufficient reserves, contributions to reserves to replace the assets on a timely basis. So the estimated contribution is about $1.5 million in 2021. And you can see from the blue line on the chart that it's gradually increasing to reflect the increased cost in the replacement of the assets. So just to kind of put it in perspective where you are today, we looked at the 2021 budget, and the capital contributions in the 2021 budget is about 1.4 million. And as I said previously, the sustainable funding contribution to replace the assets on a timely basis is about 1.5 million. So there's a small infrastructure gap in the water operations that has to be made up. Looking at the operating budget, as I say, we work with staff to come up with realistic assumptions on inflation for the various objects of expenditure for operating budget purposes. What we did is we projected increases in salaries and wages and benefits of about 2%, and miscellaneous expenses at 2%. Large increases are anticipated in the insurance, but 20% 22 and 23, and 10% thereafter. Hydro expenses were forecast an increase of about 5%. And it is a growing system, so that it contributes a little bit to the additional hydro expenses as well. Water purchases, about 2% annual increase for inflation, and an additional 3% attributed to new growth. So there's about a 5% increase required in water purchases. The existing debt charges, we use those, and we did note that 50% of the existing debt charges in the water operations are recovered from development charges. One of the things also that we incorporated is the Delaware new water supply, which we projected to commence in 2022, and that will be used instead of purchasing water from the City of London. That accounts for about $100,000 savings in 2022. And then we use the capital 5-year capital budget for 21 to 25, and the asset management plan for 26 to 30. So again, as one of the guiding principles is to avoid large fluctuations. So what we did is we projected based on those assumptions in the operating budget that I just went over. You can see the rate, we projected the rate revenue requirements to sustain the operations. And you can see on this chart, the rate revenue requirements are projected to increase about 4% annually. The increase is projected to be, the increase is projected that 3% of that increase would be the result of new growth that comes into the municipality. So the impact on the existing ratepayers in the municipality over the next 10 years, we project at only 1% annually, which is obviously less than an inflationary increase. And then looking at the water capital contributions, as I say, the contribution in 2021 was projected to be about 1.5 million, and that would increase each year because of the inflation. And you can see that the 100-year target is that green dotted line, and the water contribution based on this the financial plan that we've prepared meets that water contribution target each year. A slight decrease, as I mentioned previously, in 2021, but it's made up in future years. Looking at the reserve balances, municipalities like to have between 5 and 10% of the asset value of the municipality's infrastructure into reserves. So the target is, as you can see, the red dotted line and the green dotted line. That's your preferred target balance. And that essentially is for cash flow purposes and to meet unforeseen needs and emergency type situations. You can see the blue line, the water reserve based on the water financial plan, slight decrease in 2022 but then it increases. It meets the target balances in about 2024. And then in 2028, you see it exceeds the target balances. And the reason for that is, as I said previously, a large number of your capital expenditures do not occur until approximately 2043 timeframe. So what we're doing right now is planning for that eventuality. And as I said previously, that's the prudent approach, rather than burdening future ratepayers with huge infrastructure capital needs. Debt, we don't project any new debt over the 10-year forecast. So you do have some existing debt, which I mentioned half of it is coming from development charges. And you can see over the forecast period, your outstanding debt goes from about $2.5 million in 2020 to less than 500,000, about 250,000 in 2030. So it is decreasing. So just to kind of summarize, the financial plan does support financial sustainability. You're able to meet your existing financial obligations throughout the forecast period. It does provide sufficient flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. You saw that we have a positive and growing reserve balance to meet your future capital needs, and also to help support the existing one-time needs that you don't anticipate, emergency type situations. You have a low level of rate supported debt, and no new debt was forecast over that 10-year period. And that does provide sustainable cash flows. So, Madam Mayor, that's the end of the presentation. I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to move now to Rob Cascadden, the Director of Engineering, to provide additional comments.
Hi. So through Madam Mayor, yeah, I would like to thank Jim and his staff and Watson's, Peter and Stephen for helping coordinate between the two projects, and our internal staff as well. I was very pleased with how this turned out. I wasn't sure quite what to expect when we started the analysis. Jim was very patient as we made some modifications on the process through, as we tried to refine the numbers to better reflect the future forecast. And it was a great exercise for us at a staff level as well to go through that 10-year planning outlook to look at future costs. I'm hopeful that that council will support this as it's put forward. To me, I think it's a good result. It shows that we're in a good financial place with the water system and provides a good plan to keep it there going forward.
Thank you, Rob. I'll turn to council then. Questions, comments? I'll start with Deputy Mayor Brennan.
Yeah, not really a question, just a comment. It's very nice to see the position we're in with our water. Past years, I know we were up our water rates, and we had a lot of complaints about high water rates in our municipality. But you look at that, what happened years ago and where we are today, I think that puts us in the good position we're in today is what previous councils did. And so I'm very pleased with this report and the position we're in going forward. I think it puts us in good shape.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Councillor Arts.
Yes, thank you, through your mayor. I got one question. As subdivisions are completed, the assets are transferred to the municipality. So then that means our assets go up. Does that mean we also have to increase what we're putting into our reserve funds too?
So through Madam Mayor, so that's a great question, and yeah, we're absolutely aware of that. So we had built for the assets that are constructed, we took that into consideration for the total value of our assets. I don't believe it's been included for the future replacement cost, but as we continue to update this, we will continue to update that. So you're right. At this point, we have the benefit of the additional revenues coming in from the new growth. That future replacement cost may not be fully reflected yet. So there is that kind of lag. But as Tiffany mentioned with the asset management plan, the longer term intent is to incorporate or to look at that future growth implement that into the asset management plan as well. So we would look to do that with the water financial plan going forward as well to account for that.
Thank you.
Are there additional questions? I don't see any. Okay, we have a motion before us, and it is that report PWE 14/2021 regarding the Middlesex Center Water Financial Plan be received, and that Municipal Council approve the water plan, financial plan, which is attached, prepared for the municipal drinking water system license renewal in accordance with the Ontario Regulation 453/07. The water financial plan applies to our 3 drinking water system licenses: Middlesex Center Distribution System number 52101, Melrose Drinking Water System number 103, and the Burr Water System 104. And that the municipal treasurer submit the water financial plan to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation, Parks, and the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing in accordance with the Safe Drinking Water Act 2002. And further, that the Public Works Engineering Department staff issue notice of the water financial plan availability as prescribed in OREG 45307 on the municipal website. Do I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Cates and Deputy Mayor Brennan. Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that motion is carried. And I'll add my thanks, Jim. That was a well-prepared report, and it's always great to have this information so that we know where we're going. So I appreciate your time and input, and we'll look forward to the next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty, moving to the adoption of the minutes. Is there anyone that wants to note an error and exception? Seeing none, then the motion before us is that the minutes of Middlesex Center Council, the meeting held on April 28th, 2021, be adopted as printed. A mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Heffernan and Councillor Scott. Is anyone opposed? Seeing none, that is carried then. We can move on to the consent agenda. We only have one item here. Is anyone on council wanting to ask a question with respect to that item? Seeing no hands, then the motion before us is that item 6.1, listed under the heading of consent agenda, May 12, 2021, be adopted as recommended. A mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Cates and Councillor Shipley. Is anyone opposed? Seeing none, that is carried then. Very well. So now we're going to move to staff reports. The first item is 7.1, the asset management plan. And shoot, that would be Tiffany.
We moved past 7.1 and 7.2.
Oh, we did. Oh, yes, right. We just did that. Read the title. My apologies. We're moving to 7.3, which is again Tiffany. That is the general receivables billing and collection policy.
So through you, Mayor DeVete. So the general receivable billing and collection policy is very similar to what you would have seen in the last council meetings with respect to the tax billing and collection policy, as well as the water, wastewater, and stormwater billing and collection policy. So in the past, the municipality didn't have a formalized general receivable billing and collection policy, so we wanted to clean that up. You'll notice throughout the policy, a lot of it is very similar to property taxes and water and wastewater. When you're talking about penalties and invoices, when it'll be issued, who has authority, how it can be paid, non-sufficient funds, return checks, that kind of stuff is all the same. What I want to draw your attention to is some things that are a little bit different with general receivables. So with general receivables, normally these are things that do not have priority lien status. What priority lien status is that a municipal treasurer can place a bill, such as your water bill, onto your property taxes for collection. Property taxes is what municipalities use for overall collection due to the tax registration process, which allows a municipality to, after 2 years in arrears, to proceed with selling a property under the tax registration process. It's another year-long process, but this ensures that we have collectability on our property taxes, water, wastewater, and anything that has priority lien status. And some things covered under the general receivable policy will have priority lien status. The process for those will be to transfer it onto the property taxes, similar to water and wastewater, storm, etc. There are a few things that we do not have priority lien status. Some of these would fall into the fire department. Those would be accidents and issues that we have for people that do not live within the municipality, but we do charge them. So we've added things in here, such as an allowance for doubtful accounts. And so the allowance for doubtful accounts would be for things that we know that we can't collect. And there's a variety of reasons, and it is after a certain amount of time that staff spend trying to collect these accounts. We also have added in into this policy is the use of collection agencies. So this is something that the municipality has done currently, and it has done in the past. So we've added it in here just for clarity purposes and what the process would be. When a municipality uses collection process, it is for things that don't have priority lien status, and this collection agency has more powers and more staffing power, I would say, than we do to try to collect all this information or collect the money with the information that we have. And so this policy outlines what that process can look like. In addition, we have more of a write-off. So you'll notice in the property taxes and water policy, the write-off amount was very small, what we're allowed, and what we would do because of that collection powers. However, with some general receivables, there is a significant amount more of write-offs that could occur. And so this is addressed here in this policy. Those write-offs, depending on the amount, would come to council. They are also included in the budget to actual, depending on the volume. So if something's very small and included within the budget, you would normally not see, but anything exceeding that you would probably see right away, depending on the type of write-off it would be. And like any of our other policies, it just addresses how often this will be updated and reviewed with council. So at this point, I'll just open it up to questions if there are any on this policy.
Thank you for that presentation. Does anyone on council have questions, clarifications? I don't see any. So the motion before us is that report CPS 2020-21 general receivables billing and collection policy be received, and that the billing and collection policy appended to the report CPS 2020-21 be approved. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Heffernan and Councillor Cates. Thank you. Is anyone opposed? Seeing none, that motion is carried. And we'll ask you now, Tiffany, to move to the telephone single source system.
So thank you through you, Mayor DeVete. So the municipal telephone system is part of the 2021 budget. It's budgeted around $80,000. This would include the contract work for the actual system, as well as the IT services costs for the special project. As noted during the budget process, our phone system is on its last legs, and this year will be the last year it's supported warranty-wise. We have had some issues in the last few months, I would say, with our phone system, where there's been updates happening irregularly, just randomly. And so our phone system is quite dated. One of the things I would say as a positive was when we experienced the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic last March, our phone system is up to date enough that we were able to transition to working from home without any issues, with the voicemails being transferred into your emails. What we are looking at with the new system is similar to what 2 other municipalities in our county have already transitioned to, because they did not have the capacity and the capabilities with their prior phone systems to do what we did during the pandemic. And it is a new software. So county IT worked with these municipalities in 2020. They had done an RFP process. They had a selected candidate, and they worked throughout for both those municipalities. Ideally, with information technology, and especially with the fact that we have a service contract with county IT at the county of Middlesex, we want to ensure that we within the county and all the lower tiers are using the same equipment and software and services to make it easier for the county to actually service us. And I think this is those economies of scale, efficiencies that we can build. So this is part of that. It is built into our procurement policy. So you'll notice throughout the report, I do reference that this would be allowed under the procurement policy. However, due to the cost of it and how it is so public facing, I do want to bring it to council's attention for that approval and provide it to the manager of information technology services at Middlesex to kind of get started. I'd like to see the system implemented in June or July. We are avoiding August at all. So if we don't get the system before that, we won't be doing it until September due to the high volume of calls that we get in August due to the final tax bills. So this is why I'm bringing this report forward now. And at this point, I'll just open it up to any questions.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have questions? I don't see any. So I'll just know, as you pointed out in the report, all 3 of the criteria are met. So there is a tick in every box. The motion before us is that report CPS 2021 regarding the municipal phone system single source be received, and that the municipality proceed to single source the contract for the 2021 new phone system. And further, that the manager of information technology services at the County of Middlesex be delegated authority to negotiate and select a contractor to complete the municipal phone system upgrade within the specified budget of $80,000 or less. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Pardon me. Deputy Mayor Brennan and Councillor Scott. Is anyone opposed? Seeing none, that is carried. Thank you for that then, Ms. Tiffany, and we'll move to correspondence. Again, we only have one item here today. Any comment on that? None? Some? I see shaking of heads. So the motion before us is that the correspondence item 9.1 listed on the May 12th, 2021 council agenda be received for information. A mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Arts and Councillor Heffernan. Any opposed? And that is carried as well. Thank you. I'll turn to the Deputy Mayor then to give us the County Council update, please.
Thank you. It was mentioned right off the bat of the meeting yesterday that this is National Nurses Week. So we do salute them for all the work they've done in the last year plus with the pandemic. And we do have a close relationship with nurses in our municipality, and Councillor Shipley's wife is a nurse, so we're expecting to make her supper tonight in response to that. Next, Southwest Middlesex Mayor made a motion. I know it's a motion that he's going to bring forward at a future county council meeting for Glendon and Melbourne Drive. He would like to see a lit stop sign at that intersection for a 2-year trial period to see if that will help reduce the accidents that are at that intersection. So that will be coming forward. The Thames-Sydenham Source Water Protection Committee, the city and the county have one representation on that, and it usually switches back and forth between London and the county. And this one was Jared Craven, the PWE, a person from Thames Center, has been appointed to represent the city and the county on that committee. I'll get the mayor to speak to a couple of issues on the Women's Caucus at the end of my report or at the end of the meeting, whenever she prefers. There's a couple of things coming up. There's a webinar tomorrow night on the Women's Caucus, and then there's an award ceremony coming up, but the mayor will talk further on that in a few minutes. The province has been giving out a bunch of money, $36,825,000 for different social services things. The county has been getting allotments. The county got $119,682 in the first go round for first and last month's rent for people, support food banks, hotel stays, and rent arrears. Phase 2, the money had to be spent by March of 2021 of some of $344,000. And some of that went to community programs for $100,000, food banks, $22,000, and capital projects for $65,000. The third phase has to be spent by the end of this year, and that's a sum of $431,000. And it will involve things like transportation for medical appointments and that sort of thing. Social Services Relief Fund, just out of interest, they provide 160 hot meals per week right now throughout the county. So there is a real need for stuff out in the county. Strathmere Lodge is redoing their access control system. They received 7 bids with the budgeted amount, and KR Communications at a budget are a price of $77,000 will be doing that work. The golf tournament for the county has been changed to September the 16th, hoping that by things will be opened up and the golf courses will be opened up and we can continue on forward with that. From that, I'll turn it over to the mayor if she wants to comment on the Women's Caucus now or later. That's up to you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you very much for that update, Deputy Mayor. Yes, Women's Caucus has been invited to be we're the panel for a meeting in Lambton County tomorrow evening. It's called the Gene Collection, which is named for a woman that was involved in creating opportunities for women. So that will be, they're going to ask questions and we're just going to answer them and speak to things like what kinds of factors motivated us to run for office and who our mentors were and that kind of thing. If you Google gene collection, I think you can find the information there and register if you're interested. The other part is interesting to us personally in terms of local initiatives. The Middlesex Leading Ladies Awards is going to be a recognition of women across Middlesex County who've been contributing to the quality of life and community initiatives and all kinds of volunteer activities. And that event is going to be held on June 10th. It's an Eventbrite. You can see it in social media again, Eventbrite, register for that event. But more importantly, if you know of anybody you'd like to nominate as a woman who deserves recognition, I would encourage you to send their name and where she's from and why you want her recognized, and make sure that comes into the address, the mail-in address by May 31st. So also pencil that date in on June 21st to attend that, June 10th, 2021 to attend that event. So that was all I think for county then. So there are no other items under new business or other business. So I can now go to closed session, I guess. That's great. Yeah, so we need a motion then to go into closed, which is that the council for the Municipality of Middlesex Centre adjourned to closed session at 11:16 pursuant to section 239(2) of the Municipal Act 2001 as amended to discuss the following matters. Under section C, a proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality or local board, and under section E, litigation or potential litigation, including matters before administrative tribunals affecting the municipality or local board. If I could have a mover and a seconder, please. I see Deputy Mayor Brennan and Councillor Arts. Is anyone opposed? Seeing none, then we need to go out of this screen and go to the other